You have violated Section 3, Subsection A of the bylaws. This retroactive approval is completely unacceptable, and you know it.
I didn't raise my voice when the HOA president stood up so fast her chair tipped backward. I didn't interrupt her when she started shouting about trespassing, about how grief didn't give me special privileges, about how she had asked a simple question and I had refused to cooperate. I just reached into the folder I'd brought with me, slid a single document across the folding table, and watched her words dissolve halfway through the sentence. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was the quiet kind of moment that only happens when someone realizes the ground they're standing on no longer belongs to them. The HOA's attorney leaned forward, adjusted his glasses, and read the header twice. Then his face changed. Not panic, exactly. More like someone who just realized they'd been playing a game on the wrong board the entire time. Before any of that, before the meetings and letters and whispered threats, I hadn't been trying to make a statement or prove a point. I had inherited the land because there was no one else left to take it. 900 acres spread across low hills and timber pockets, a place my grandfather bought decades ago when nobody thought it was worth anything except quiet. It came to me in the middle of a season when funerals blur together, when people say your name softly and ask if you're holding up. I wasn't thinking about power or leverage. I was thinking about how the air smelled the same way it did when I was a kid, about the way the creek still cut the same path through the back acreage, about how my grandfather used to say land remembers, who treats it gently. I moved out there because I wanted distance, not authority. I wanted mornings that started slow and evenings that ended without noise. I wanted to fix up the old structures, keep the fences standing, and let the rest of the world handle its own arguments somewhere else. For the first few weeks, that's exactly what I did. I stayed mostly on my side of the property, sorting paperwork, meeting with the county to update tax records, walking boundary lines with an old survey map folded in my back pocket. The HOA existed, technically, but it felt far away. Their subdivision sat along one edge of the land, rows of neat houses and paved roads that hadn't been there when my grandfather first bought the place. I didn't resent it. Development happens. People build where they're allowed to build. I assumed everything had been done properly, that someone somewhere had signed off on it long before I ever entered the picture. I waved when I passed people on the access road. I nodded at the security patrol once or twice. I wasn't trying to be invisible, but I wasn't trying to be noticed either. The first letter came less than 2 weeks after the funeral. It was taped to the temporary mailbox I'd set up near the main gate, printed on thick paper with a bold HOA logo at the top. It informed me that I was in violation for failing to register as a non-resident landholder under their association rules, and that I needed to submit an access request if I planned to continue using HOA-managed roads. I remember reading it twice, not because it was confusing, but because it felt misplaced, like mail delivered to the wrong house. I checked the address. It was mine. I checked the map. The road in question had been there before the HOA, before the houses, before asphalt. I assumed it was a mistake. Clerical error. Someone new at the office not knowing where the boundary lines actually ran. I responded politely. I included copies of the county plat map, highlighted the easement language, and explained that I wasn't a member of the HOA, hadn't opted in, and didn't require permission to access my own land. I thanked them for their time and suggested we clear it up before it turned into a misunderstanding. The reply didn't come for a week, and when it did, it was shorter and colder. They insisted their records showed otherwise. They attached a fine schedule. They advised me to comply promptly to avoid escalation. That was the first time I felt something shift, not anger exactly, but the awareness that I wasn't dealing with confusion anymore. I was dealing with confidence built on incomplete information. Things accelerated after that. A notice appeared on one of the fence lines warning that unauthorized structures would be removed. Another letter arrived claiming I had obstructed HOA maintenance access by repairing an old cattle gate. When I called the number listed, I was transferred 3 times before someone told me very calmly that the board would be reviewing my status at their next meeting. I asked which statute gave them authority over inherited agricultural land outside their membership boundary. There was a pause, and then I was told I was welcome to attend and present my concerns. The tone wasn't hostile. It was dismissive, which somehow felt worse. I went to that meeting expecting a conversation. I brought documents, maps, copies of deeds going back decades. I explained the situation again, slower this time, pointing to dates and recorded surveys. The HOA president listened with her arms crossed, nodding in a way that suggested patience rather than agreement. When I finished, she asked me where the will was. Not whether I had one, not whether probate had cleared. She asked where it was, as if I'd failed to bring proof of something obvious. When I told her it was filed with the county and already processed, she smiled and said they'd need to see it. That was when the room changed. A few board members avoided eye contact. Someone scribbled a note. The president leaned back and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that people claim things all the time, especially after funerals. I left without arguing. I didn't raise my voice or threaten anything. I went home, made coffee, and laid everything out on the kitchen table. The letters, the maps, the HOA bylaws they'd handed me like they were law. I realized then that this wasn't going to resolve itself through politeness. Not because I was wrong, but because they believed they were untouchable. The subdivision had been there long enough that no one questioned its footprint. The HOA had grown used to issuing orders, not receiving corrections. So I stopped trying to convince them and started verifying everything for myself. I pulled the original deed transfer records from the county archive, the ones that still referenced fence posts and creek bends instead of street names. I requested zoning overlays, easement histories, infrastructure approvals. I spent nights reading statutes most people never think about unless they're forced to. Property law isn't dramatic. It's precise. And precision, I've learned, is far more dangerous than anger. As the weeks went on, the pressure increased. Fines appeared for things I hadn't done. A security vehicle blocked the access road one morning, claiming temporary HOA control. Neighbors stopped waving. A couple of them looked uncomfortable when I passed, like they'd been told something about me that made conversation risky. My partner asked if we should talk to a lawyer. I told her I already was, in a way. Every document I read, every record I pulled, was another piece of a structure the HOA didn't know existed yet. I wasn't building a case to threaten them. I was building one to end the conversation entirely. What finally broke it open was a set of infrastructure permits from the late 70s, buried in a batch of scanned microfilm records. They showed the initial approval for the subdivision roads, the drainage, the utilities, and right there, in black and white, was the condition that had never been updated, never been renegotiated, never been extinguished. The land beneath a significant portion of the HOA's footprint had never been conveyed. It had been leased, temporarily, contingent on terms that expired quietly while everyone assumed permanence. I sat there for a long time after I realized what I was looking at, not smiling, not celebrating, just letting the weight of it settle. They hadn't stolen anything intentionally. They'd just forgotten who owned it. That was when I stopped responding to letters altogether and started preparing for the meeting where I would only need to speak once. By the time the HOA scheduled the next board meeting, I already knew how it would go, even if they didn't. They sent the notice by certified mail this time, heavy on formality, light on explanation. The agenda listed land use violations, unauthorized access, and something vaguely worded about ownership clarification. I didn't respond. I didn't argue. I didn't submit documents ahead of time the way they requested. I had learned by then that people who assume authority rarely read anything that contradicts them until they're forced to do so in person. Silence, in this case, wasn't avoidance. It was positioning. In the days leading up to the meeting, I kept my routine exactly the same. I woke up early, walked the eastern boundary where the trees thinned out near the creek, checked the fence, lines that had been there longer than the subdivision's oldest house. I fixed a loose hinge on the barn door and cleared brush along a section of land the HOA claimed was a buffer zone, even though the county survey made no mention of such a thing. Neighbors drove past more slowly than they used to. A few stared. One woman I recognized from the meeting stopped her car once and asked carefully if everything was okay. I told her the truth. I said it was complicated but under control. She nodded like she didn't fully believe me, and I didn't. Blame her. From the outside, it probably looked like I was about to get steamrolled. What the HOA didn't know was that their own escalation had created a record they couldn't erase. Every fine, every blocked access point, every threatening letter had been documented, time-stamped, and tied back to statutes they hadn't bothered to check. My attorney confirmed what the documents already showed. The land transfer had been clean. The lease conditions had lapsed. The HOA existed on a foundation that was legally thinner than anyone had bothered to acknowledge. He didn't sound excited when he said it. He sounded impressed in the quiet way professionals do when they realize they're looking at something rare. He told me not to rush. He told me to let them talk first. So when I walked into the community hall that evening, I didn't look like someone preparing for a confrontation. I looked like someone attending a meeting he expected to end early. The room was full. Board members sat rigidly at the front, papers stacked in neat piles. A handful of residents filled the folding chairs, drawn by rumor more than understanding. The HOA president stood as soon as she saw me, her posture stiff, her expression rehearsed. She began talking before I sat down, outlining violations, accusing me of ignoring correspondence, suggesting that my recent activities were disruptive to the community. She used words like responsibility and transparency, as if repeating them enough times would make them apply. I waited. I let her finish. When she finally asked if I had anything to say, I stood, reached into my folder and placed the first document on the table. Then the second. Then the third. I didn't explain them. I didn't summarize. I let the attorney do what attorneys do when faced with something unexpected. He read. He flipped pages. He frowned. The room went quiet in that specific way it does. When people sense momentum shifting but don't yet know in which direction. The HOA president asked what those papers were. I told her they were the reason none of her fines were enforceable. That was when she laughed. It wasn't cruel. It was dismissive. The kind of laugh people use when they think someone has misunderstood how things work. She asked me again where the will was. Louder this time, as if volume could substitute for relevance. I told her the will wasn't the issue. Ownership wasn't the issue. Authority was. And that was when her attorney asked for a brief recess. They stepped into the hallway. The board followed. The residents stayed seated, whispering to each other, glancing at me like I'd just spoken a language they didn't know existed. I sat back down and waited. When they returned, the attorney's demeanor had changed. He no longer looked annoyed. He looked careful. He asked me where I'd obtained the permits. I told him the county archive. He asked how long I'd had them. I told him long enough. He didn't ask any more questions after that. The meeting ended without a vote, without fines, without threats. The HOA president said they would need time to review new information. I agreed. I left before anyone could. Stop me! The next morning, the security vehicle wasn't blocking the road. The signs came down a few days later. Official letters followed, written in language so cautious it bordered on apologetic. They asked for clarification. They asked for copies. They asked for time. I gave them exactly what the law required and nothing more. What followed wasn't explosive. There was no dramatic collapse, no single moment where everything fell apart at once. Instead, it was a slow unraveling. Board members resigned quietly. The president stopped answering emails. Residents began asking questions the HOA couldn't answer without admitting what they'd overlooked for years. The association hired outside counsel, then another, then a consultant. None of it changed the facts. The land didn't move. The records didn't change. The authority they'd assumed simply wasn't there. By the time the county formally acknowledged the corrected boundaries and ownership status, the fight was already over. The HOA still existed, technically, but smaller, quieter, more cautious. They stopped issuing fines like confetti. They stopped pretending their rules extended beyond what they actually controlled. A few neighbors apologized. Others avoided me entirely. I didn't push for anything more than what was already mine. I didn't need to. The power shift had done its work without spectacle. Now, when I walk the property, it feels like it did before all of this started. Quiet, grounded, honest. The land hasn't changed, but the air around it has. People understand something they didn't before. Something easy to forget when paperwork piles up and authority goes unchecked. Ownership isn't loud. It doesn't need to announce itself. It just waits, patient and solid, until someone finally reads the fine print. The weeks after the meeting were quieter on the surface, but underneath everything felt different. Not better yet, just different. The kind of quiet that comes after people realize they pushed too far and don't know how to walk it back without admitting they were wrong. The HOA stopped contacting me directly. Instead, I received letters from their new legal counsel, carefully worded, almost apologetic in tone, asking for clarification on documents they had already received. Each one took longer to arrive than the last, as if hesitation itself had become policy. Neighbors began testing the waters. One man I'd seen at the meeting caught up to me while I was repairing a fence line near the old oak stand. He didn't accuse or threaten. He just asked, quietly, if it was true that the land under the subdivision had never belonged to the HOA at all. I told him the truth, not dramatically, not defensively. I told him the land had always been leased, that the paperwork had been public record for decades, and that nothing had changed except the HOA's willingness to acknowledge it. He stood there longer than necessary after I finished, nodding slowly, as if recalibrating something he'd believed his entire adult life. That moment repeated itself in different forms over the next few months. People didn't approach me with anger anymore. They approached with confusion, and confusion, I learned, was far more dangerous to the HOA than hostility ever had been. Hostility could be dismissed as emotional. Confusion demanded answers. The HOA board tried to regain control by tightening internal rules, raising dues, and blaming external interference for budget shortfalls. But their authority had already cracked. Once residents realized the board hadn't even known who owned the land beneath them, everything else they claimed to manage suddenly felt negotiable. Meetings grew tense. Attendance dropped. Votes were challenged. Transparency requests started circulating. I didn't attend. I didn't need to. The unraveling had momentum of its own now. At home, though, things were heavier. My partner worried about what would come next. Not legally, but socially. She had seen how quickly the narrative turned once already, how rumors filled gaps when facts felt inconvenient. I couldn't promise her there wouldn't be more tension. I could only promise that I wouldn't give them anything real to use against us. That promise mattered more than comfort. We both understood that. There were nights I lay awake replaying the early moments, wondering if I could have stopped it sooner by explaining more, by being more visible, by reminding people gently that the land was leased. But that thought never lasted long. The HOA hadn't escalated because of ignorance alone. They escalated because they believed I wouldn't push back, because quiet people are often mistaken for weak ones. That wasn't a misunderstanding I felt obligated to correct until they forced the issue. The county eventually sent an inspector, not because of anything I'd done, but because the HOA requested a review of easement boundaries, hoping, I think, to find something they could reinterpret. The inspector walked the land with me for most of a morning. He didn't rush. He checked maps against markers, notes against records. At the end, he signed off on everything without comment. When I asked if this kind of dispute was common, he shrugged and said it usually ended before it got this far. I understood what he meant. Most people would have folded earlier. That inspection closed the last door the HOA hadn't realized they were leaning on. After that, their legal strategy shifted from challenge to containment. They stopped talking about ownership entirely. Instead, they focused on internal reforms, new leadership, revised mission statements. The president resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Her replacement was careful, younger, visibly uncomfortable with confrontation. The tone of official correspondence softened to the point of neutrality. They didn't apologize. But they stopped pretending they had leverage. What surprised me most was how quickly the land itself became neutral ground again. Kids cut across the pasture paths like they always had. People walked dogs along the service road without looking over their shoulders. The fear that had crept into the air during the worst of it dissipated faster than I expected. Maybe because it had never really belonged there. Fear, like authority, only works when people believe it's justified. I didn't seek compensation. I didn't sue. My attorney asked if I wanted to explore damages for harassment or interference. I told him, no, not because I couldn't have won, but because the fight I needed to finish wasn't about punishment. It was about restoration. I wanted the land back in the way that mattered most. Quiet, undisputed, whole. Now, when I think back to the funeral, to the moment she shouted across the room asking where the will was, I realized that wasn't really about inheritance. It was about entitlement. She assumed that anything unchallenged must be unclaimed, that silence meant absence. She never imagined that the answer to her question had been filed, recorded, renewed, and waiting long before she ever knew my family's name. The land doesn't care who sits on which board or who shouts the loudest at a meeting. It remembers ownership differently. In boundaries, in records, in patience. I learned that too, slowly, deliberately, the hard way. And now, every morning when I step onto the porch with my coffee and look out over the acreage my family kept intact for generations, I feel something settle inside me that had been restless for years. Not victory, not pride, just certainty. The real consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do. They came in small confirmations, spaced far enough apart that each one felt accidental. If you weren't paying attention, a returned letter marked "Board dissolved pending reorganization." A new HOA website that quietly removed the word ownership from every page. A revised budget that showed ground rent listed plainly without commentary, without protest. Just another fixed expense they could no longer pretend wasn't real. I stayed out of it. That was deliberate. Power, I learned, is most effective when it doesn't hover. I didn't attend meetings. I didn't speak to the press when a local paper called asking about a dispute involving legacy land rights. I told them it wasn't a dispute. It was a contract being followed. They didn't print the story. That was fine. I wasn't trying to teach a lesson. I was letting one land. What I did do was walk the property more than I had in years. Not to inspect, not to document, but to reconnect. I followed the fence lines my grandfather had set by hand, the ones that never quite ran straight because he'd measured by eye instead of instrument. I checked the old boundary stones half buried in grass, the ones my father had pointed out. To me when I was young, explaining why you never move a marker, even if you think it's inconvenient, especially then. Ownership, he'd said, isn't something you assert. It's something you maintain. The subdivision felt smaller now, not physically, but psychologically. Without the illusion of permanence, the houses looked like what they had, always been, structures built with permission, not entitlement. I didn't resent them for it. I never had. Most of the residents had no idea where their foundations really sat, and I couldn't blame them for trusting what they'd been told. But trust, I realized, is only dangerous when it's paired with authority that refuses to verify itself. There was one last meeting I attended months later, not as a confrontation, but as a formality. The new board had asked if I would sit in, briefly, while they voted to ratify the lease acknowledgement for their records. It was the first time they'd ever used that phrase. Lease acknowledgement. They spoke carefully, reading from prepared notes, no improvisation. When the vote passed unanimously, no one clapped. No one looked relieved. It felt less like an ending, and more like an alignment, something clicking back into place after being forced for too long. On the way out, one of the board members stopped me and said something I hadn't expected. She thanked me, not for raising the rent, not for backing them into a corner, but for not embarrassing them publicly when I could have. I told her the truth. I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted to stop a pattern. She nodded like someone who understood exactly what that meant, maybe because she was still untangling the aftermath of it herself. At home, things softened. My partner stopped watching the road every time a car slowed near the gate. We stopped bracing for letters that never came. Life returned to the rhythms we'd built before any of this started. Repairs, mornings, long afternoons where nothing happened at all. The kind of time you don't appreciate until someone tries to take control of it. Occasionally, someone new would move into the subdivision and ask me cautiously if the stories were true. I'd tell them the same thing every time. The land is leased. The terms are clear. The rent is fair. And as long as everyone respects the agreement, there's nothing to worry about. Most of them relaxed after that. A few didn't. Those were usually the ones who had assumed rules only flowed one direction. The strangest part was how little satisfaction I felt when it was all over. Not disappointment, just neutrality. Revenge implies emotion, heat, something unresolved finally discharged. This hadn't been that. This had been correction. Maintenance, like fixing a fence that had been leaning for years because no one wanted to admit the post was rotting. I still think about the moment she asked where the will was, her voice sharp, public, certain. She thought she was exposing a weakness. What she was really doing was announcing how little she understood about the ground she stood on. That misunderstanding cost her position, her authority, and the illusion that volume equals power. Now, when I drive through the subdivision, some people wave, some don't. The HOA trucks move slower. The signs are fewer. The land remains exactly what it has always been, indifferent to hierarchy, loyal only to record and care. And every so often, when the light hits the pasture just right in the early morning, I think about how close I came to giving up something irreplaceable just to avoid discomfort. I'm glad I didn't. I didn't expect the quiet to last, but it did. Not the fragile kind that comes from people holding their breath, waiting for the next escalation, but the settled kind that comes after boundaries are finally respected. The kind where nothing needs to be said anymore because the rules are no longer imaginary. The funeral felt like it happened in a different life now, though I can still picture it with uncomfortable clarity. The small chapel, the smell of old wood and lilies, the way grief makes people behave as if social rules are optional. I had been standing near the back, half listening to the service, half trying to keep my composure, when she leaned over and asked me where the will was. Not quietly, not privately. Loud enough that a few heads turned. It wasn't curiosity. It was accusation dressed as entitlement, as if my inheritance was a clerical error she intended to correct. At the time, I didn't understand how revealing that moment would become. I thought she was just rude, opportunistic, maybe a little drunk on her own authority. It took months for me to realize she had been showing me exactly how the HOA viewed the land, and by extension me, as an administrative inconvenience, a missing document, a technicality they assumed would fold under pressure if they pushed hard enough. That assumption shaped everything that followed. They never believed I'd read the bylaws. They never believed I'd pull the county records myself instead of trusting. the summaries they circulated internally. They never believed I'd sit alone at a kitchen table night after night, comparing parcel maps from different decades, noticing how the boundary lines shifted slightly in each retelling, always in their favor. They were used to winning by volume and repetition, not precision. The most telling part in hindsight was how often they said things like, "Everyone knows," or "It's always been understood." Those phrases are dangerous. They're what people use when they don't have documentation, when custom has replaced consent. The law doesn't recognize what everyone knows. It recognizes what's recorded, witnessed, and enforceable. Once that became clear to me, the outcome stopped. Feeling uncertain, I never told them about the full extent of the land until I had to. 900 acres sounds abstract until you walk it, until you see how roads snake through it, how utilities cross it, how much of what they called common infrastructure depended entirely on easements they didn't control. They had assumed the land was a backdrop. It was the stage. When the reassessments and acknowledgments were finalized, a few residents tried to organize, not against me exactly, but against the idea that they had been misled for so long. I understood the impulse. No one likes finding out that the security they were promised was conditional, but anger needs a target, and the truth rarely volunteers. For the role, I stayed consistent, calm, available, but not defensive. I answered questions when asked, provided copies of documents when requested, and declined every invitation to debate hypotheticals. I wasn't interested in rewriting history to make anyone feel better. The history already existed. It just hadn't been read. Over time, even the most vocal critics quieted down. Not because they agreed with me, but because the facts stopped moving. There's a point where resistance becomes exhausting when nothing responds to it. You can only shout at a fence for so long before you accept that it isn't listening. What surprised me most was how much lighter everything felt once the conflict was over. I hadn't realized how much energy I'd been spending simply anticipating interference, bracing, preparing explanations no one deserved. When that weight lifted, I found myself sleeping better, thinking more clearly, enjoying the land again instead of defending it. I planted trees that spring, not as a statement, just as something I'd been putting off. I repaired a section of barn roof that had leaked for years because it never felt urgent enough. I let myself imagine staying long-term, not just enduring. The HOA still exists, technically. It always will in some form. But it operates now the way it was always supposed to, managing appearances, not asserting ownership it never had. They submit notices properly. They ask instead of declare. They check before they assume. That change didn't come from kindness. It came from consequence. Sometimes people ask me if I'd do it all again the same way. If I'd still stay quiet. At the funeral, still wait. Still let things escalate instead of cutting them off early. I think about that for a while before answering, because the honest response isn't satisfying. I didn't want any of this. I didn't want to become a lesson or a cautionary tale, but I also learned that peace maintained by surrender is temporary, and boundaries only exist if you're willing to enforce them when tested. If I'd given in early, agreed to reasonable adjustments, smoothed things over for the sake of harmony, it wouldn't have ended there. It never does. What ended it was clarity. Now, when I walk the land in the early morning, the fog still settles the same way it always has. The hills don't care about titles or boards or accusations. They respond to stewardship, not authority. That's something my grandfather understood instinctively, my father respected deliberately, and I had to learn under pressure. The HOA knows what's under their feet now, and so do I.